Now, we are lucky enough to be joined by Bundeep Rangar, Chairman of IndusView, to go through the papers with us this morning. Thank you very much for coming in, Bundeep. Starting with the Independent and Bahrain, matters in Bahrain, of course, highlighting the strategic importance of this tiny, tiny kingdom.
Well, it is the base for the U.S. Fifth Fleet. It's also the base for the British presence in this region. And to the extent that Britain's coming under fire, it's because you don't really control what the end use is, if you may, for what you sell. But right here, tear gas shells, well, there's not many other uses besides controlling crowds and mobs, right? So that's where the criticism comes from.
Which actually puts the British government in a slightly awkward position because, yes, Bahrain is a very key ally. You don't want to alienate them, but at the same time, what do you do about these goods? Even if order is restored, does that mean you stop selling them, period, or still maintain the trade?
And order restored for whom, right? That's the inherent conflict here. Do you support a democratic upsurge of popular support, or do you support a regime that's a bit more authoritarian, which is going to use the equipment you're sending to suppress the crowd? And that's a philosophical tension.
So what is the way to play this then?
Well, you can't control what's sold completely unless you, of course, look at end usage and curtail, which we're doing now. So it's a bit of rear guard action right now.
Moving on to the Times, Cameron is clear to defy Europe on human rights. Of course, the Eurosceptics in this country will be delighted to hear this.
You know what, there's a great article a few days ago about how of all the banks that lobby in the corridors of power at Brussels, Britain has a sum total of 0. So we're just completely isolated when it comes to looking at the UK's directives versus the European. And this is a bit of a reminder that, you know what, we may not be part of the euro currency, but we're certainly part of the eurozone. And if it is going to challenge some of the European directives, it'll be in defiance, as the paper points out, as opposed to something that's going to be in complete harmony. I don't believe he'll go and challenge it, because ultimately it's not going to be winning him many votes if he does.
Yeah, because they've actually said in the article that it confirms that this document that the Times is citing, that the court in Strasbourg has no legal powers to force the government to pay compensation for denying prisoners their human rights. So even though there's much talk about the size of a legal bill, in a sense it's academic. It is
absolutely academic, and at the end of the day it's not going to affect him, as I said, in the political side, so why bother?
Moving on to G20, the French chair, and obviously this is a group of countries very divergent in terms of their interests, their priorities. You've got the US, you've got China. What's going to be the major issues or problems that they're going to face?
Disparity. So if you look at the protests in Egypt, or you look at them and elsewhere, you've seen not only an opposition to authoritarian regimes, but also a huge driver from the fact that Egypt has 40% unemployment, doubling of food prices, particularly things like wheat, which Egypt is the biggest importer of, and across the G20 zone, there's just two functioning economies. Some countries are working faster than the others, and that whole recovery of the global economy is not spreading across the G20 evenly. And within the G20 countries, there's disparity within the top layer, which is benefiting a lot more than as in Egypt's case. You saw the consequences of 40% unemployment.
Well, there's a suggestion also in the paper that the G20 itself is battling to justify its very existence.
Its own existence, absolutely. Well, because you look at the G8, which had its own raison d'etre, the G20 was a recognition of growing economies with the developed economies. But so what happens from there? Are you defining policy? Mm-hmm. Are you creating sanctions like we talked before? Or what is the actual purpose beyond just healthy debate? But then that's kind of all talk and no action.
And then you've got the offshoot of the G20, the BRICS,
which are probably the rising stars within the world economy that are getting out the world out of the recession today. But how do you get the G8 and the BRICS to take concerted action to stop things that we see right now in the Middle East?
We touched on another important point as well when you look at that relationship between the G20 and the BRICS, because one of the other issues they're going to be looking at with this meeting is, of course, the currency play. The accusation being that China, using its authority to lower the currency, it works in favour of the exporters. China, of course, has always denied this. They're never going to get this resolved because China can actually afford to say we're not doing anything wrong from a position of strength.
And if you look at other bodies, like say the World Trade Organization, you have imperatives there, you have agreements there. GATT provides for agreements, World Trade Organization provides for agreements. The G20 ultimately doesn't come up with resolutions that are binding or even indicative principles that companies can say we adhere to. This is a forum for debate, and the challenge, like you said before, is converting that into something that's meaningful.
Moving on to El País, of course, the Spanish serious daily, suggesting that confidence is returning somewhat to the Spanish economy.
Not great for the bankers trying to sell those bonds there, is it? Because the price in those bonds, the yields in those bonds are lower. On the other hand, for an economy in Europe, which has the highest unemployment, 20%, it's a good sign because it means that they can sell their debt at a cheaper price, and that means investors are getting more confident. The word just 2 months ago we were talking about it here.
But not quite out of the woods yet. Having said that, the last set of economic numbers that came through from Spain were actually quite surprising, given that they've been completely caned on the property market.
Yeah, the recovery is taking shape there, and I guess they've at least floored out. There's no worsening of the situation like we've seen in some other places like Ireland, and maybe there's a pickup happening here.
Right, but does that take us away from the big question as to who's next? And I'm talking about contagion, because the lineup of the order was Greece, then it was Ireland, the possibility Spain. If we can bypass Spain, does that mean that perhaps Portugal's safe? Could there be another one that may be heading for a fall?
If you take all of those combined, Italy's in excess of that. So I think the next one to watch out for, and we don't have a lot of transparency given Berlusconi's regime there, I think that's one to watch out a little bit more.
Right, so we'll know you to that one that Italy's going to take a look at. You heard it here
Moving on
first.
to the Financial Times, Ed Balls, the fairly newly appointed Shadow Chancellor here in the UK, really setting out his stall in an interview with the FT.
So one of the first big statements he's made now, isn't he? Well, the problem is the monetary policy that they set, the interest rate setting, is such a powerful instrument both economically and politically, because it has such a ripple effect consequence in the economy, that you can't be apolitical in the manner that Ed Balls is suggesting, I believe. I think it's very, very difficult to say you're completely focusing on getting the economy back on track.
Because he's got some harsh words, hasn't he, for the Governor of the Bank of England, Mervyn King.
And then you saw the convergence of the powers within the Bank of England and increasing taking over of what would normally be a regulatory oversight by the Financial Services Authority. And that, by its nature, creates a political role as much as an economic role. Easy thing to pick on, but I don't think an easy thing to solve.
Okay, but at least they get plenty of sleep. They've sussed it out by watching the Bears.
The Bears?
Yes, the Bears.
As
the
opposed to
Bears
bear markets.
who hibernate for between 5 and 7 months. Wouldn't you rather like that? Just hibernate for between 5 and 7 months?
What would that do
Only
for
if I was a
beauty
lady
sleep?
who
It's a whole
lounged.
different world. Not very good for the cosmetic industry, I guess. But
No, but scientists have worked out that the biological changes that they undergo could be really handy in terms of helping astronauts and various other people who do stressful.
And I suppose that
think
how
we're-
many of us will be astronauts, really?
well, Virgin Galactica is not far around the corner, right? So maybe it'll be helpful for them to look at
All
how
right, so there's a possible market mover here.
some real-time effect for us here, but otherwise it's too far out for us to get to space, isn't it?
Bundeep, thank you so much indeed.
Thanks,
Bundeep
Bundeep.
Rangar of IndusView, thank you very much indeed for taking us through the papers this morning here at BBC World News. And a quick reminder of the main news this morning, and that of course is the situation in Bahrain, where there's a lot of tension as funerals take place and indeed Friday prayers there in the capital, Manama.